Well, let's talk a little bit about where you went to grade school. What was or how far away was the building?
Well, the building was a mile and a half from where I lived, and it was a one-room school. Later on, they built a barn so the people that rode horses could put their horses into the barn, especially in the winter time. And there were some families that rode horses. I didn't have a horse, so I didn't ride the horse. Uh, and we had, of course, one teacher and 8 grades in one room. And I was always interested in what was going on. I guess I was a fairly good student. I was interested in studying and learned quickly, I guess. Sat most of the time I sat fairly close to the front of the building or the room, and the class would do their class work or their recitations and things right on the front seat, so I was fairly close to it, and I would hear what they were doing, and I kind of picked up the second, third, fourth, fifth grade, sixth grade, seventh grade things when I was in the first grade, and every year after that I would still do the same thing. And we were fortunate that we had excellent teachers, teachers that really cared, that most of them knew their work very well, and I felt that we learned a lot. I started when I was 5, and then in my third and fourth grade, in the third grade, I was the only student. So when half the year was passed, the teacher decided she'd put me in the fourth grade. There was one other student in the fourth grade, so she put me in that grade. However, there were more students in the fourth grade, but she put me in with them, and then I stayed with them till through the 8th grade. But it was, I felt it was a very nurturing experience in the school, that everybody kind of cared and everybody worked together, and we had a lot of fun a lot of times. Then the teacher that we had in the 6th grade thought that maybe we could graduate, take the county exams. You took county exams at that time, and if you passed the county exams, she thought maybe we could go to high school the next year. Well, I passed the county exams with real good marks, but they wouldn't let me go to high school because I was just too young. I guess I was 13 at the time, so I would have started high school at 14. And no, I wasn't that old. I was, 12. I was 10. And I would have started high school at 11. And they didn't think that was, or 9, and I would have been 10, because I graduated when I was 15. I spent a couple of more years in grade school. But, and that kind of doused my spirit of learning, because I felt that I was ready for high school, and I had to waste 2 more years in grade school learning the things that I already knew. In fact, I had better grades in the county exams at the end of the 6th grade than I did at the end of the 8th grade. So. One of the other things that I remember from grade school is when I was in the 1st grade, and during recess time, a couple of the other students and I were sitting on the steps of the school, and the teacher, I felt, was inside the school. She wasn't around, so we were talking German on the steps, and all of a sudden I felt her hand on the collar of my coat, lifting me up and saying, "We speak English here." So after that I spoke English. I didn't speak German anymore unless I knew that I was off somewhere where she wasn't around. But as I say, we had good teachers, and she wasn't mad or anything. She just did what she was supposed to do. One of the other things, and I was in the first grade then too, my cousin was in the 8th grade, and they did a lot of acetylene welding. And back then, you made your own carbide. So he took some of the pebbles of the carbide and took it to school and put a pebble into the ink bottle put water in the ink bottle and put the pebble in there, which of course made it boil. And the teacher says, "What's going on there?" And he says, "I don't know. I think the sun is so hot it's boiling the ink bottle." Naturally, he didn't get away with that too well, but those are some of the things that now young people don't even know what carbide is or how you use it in welding, but it all comes in a pre-packaged container. So, but I always enjoyed going to school. I enjoyed learning. And one of the other things is that when I was in the 7th grade, our teacher, who was a very good teacher, but he had trouble with math. He just didn't seem to know, or couldn't figure math out too well. My dad was good in math, even though my dad never graduated from grade school. He only went through the 6th grade. And so the teacher during the winter months stayed at our house. So when we got home from school after supper, my dad and I and the teacher would sit down and do the math problems or arithmetic problems for the next day. And it was interesting because sometimes the teacher would get the answer and sometimes I would and sometimes my dad would. But it was kind of a cooperative experience and enterprise there to make sure that he had the things correct for the next day in the math.
Did you often have teachers board with you?
That was the only year we ever had teachers board with us. Many of them lived close by, like in Hazen or so on. They would just drive back and forth. This fella lived about 5 miles away, I guess, or 6 miles away, but it was out in the country, and so he just decided to board rather than, I don't think he even had a car, so he boarded with us.
Right. What is your favorite memory from grade school?
My favorite memory, I guess, in grade school was feeling that I could learn real well and real fast, and I could. It was always that I kind of knew my stuff and just felt good to be able to do well in the class. Play with the kids at recess time. It was fun.
What would you play?
Oh, we would play tag, or we would play Ante-I over, where you throw the ball over the barn or over the schoolhouse, and then if a person would catch it, then you'd run over and try to tag the people on the other side. Hide and seek, we would play some of that. No baseball or softball or anything like that. We just, I don't think any of us had any money for bats and balls and most of the other stuff. We had some cheap balls that we would throw over the building, but that was about it.
Right. How about days when it was too cold to go outside? What would you do for recess?
There weren't any days like that. You always bundled up and went outside regardless. Of course, when we had the barn there, then sometimes we would go in the barn if it was windy and really raw, but or we'd be on the side of the schoolhouse, So, but I can't remember staying inside because it was too cold.
Okay. What would you bring with you for lunch?
I guess most of the time it was like a sandwich or something that Mom would pack for me, and then I'd have some. I can't even remember what I had to drink, but there was a thermos bottle in the. So I had either coffee or tea, I guess, or something like that. And lunch was very simple. You know, we didn't have a lot, so you made do with what you had.
Right. Did you ever have parties or programs at the school?
We didn't have very many parties, but we always had a Christmas program at the school. And that meant that we would learn some poems or readings or something like that. And then the parents would come in the evening and we would have the Christmas program. And it was kind of nice. I don't know, it was just one of those things you did and celebrated Christmas in school. And there was no question about religion or, you know, that you could talk about the birth of Jesus and everything else in school and everybody was on the same plane, so it didn't make any difference.
Right. Is there anything else you'd like to share about your grade school?
I think that's about the extent of the grade school experience.
Okay. Well then, let's talk a little bit about church when you were growing up. Where was the church that you attended?
The church was in town, 7 miles away, and when I first started going to church that I can remember, it was all in German, and of course I understood the German probably as well or better than I did the English. We had a yoke parish where we had a church in Hazen and Zapp and Golden Valley. And so the minister would preach one Sunday in each church, so he'd be back every third Sunday. And then in the afternoon, generally the services in the morning were over an hour long. The minister would preach for quite a while. In fact, we had one minister that preached for nearly an hour. And when some of the people kind of talked to him and said, you know, can you cut it down a little bit? He said, well, I thought I was only here every 3 weeks, once every 3 weeks, so I really wanted to give you, you know, a worthwhile sermon. But then he cut it down and shortened it up a little bit. We had Sunday school before the church service, and we would go down the basement and have our lessons down there. Had a couple of classes, I guess. And basically it was reading some scripture and talking about it. Teacher tried to explain it, and we would have a little discussion about it and so on. Had a memory verse that we memorized every Sunday, and then we would go upstairs and all of us would be in church. And of course the men would sit on one side and the women would sit on the other. So it meant the boys sat on one side and the girls would sit on the other side. And the boys and girls always sat in the front pew, so the minister could see whether they were behaving or not. And if you didn't behave, then probably one of the parents generally would come up and tap you on the head or remind you that you needed to sit quiet and listen. And then in the afternoon, we would have a prayer meeting. And we would generally bring our lunch and have lunch, and then I think it was around 2 o'clock or so we would have a prayer meeting. And again, there'd be some reading of scripture and there'd be a lot of prayer, and generally everybody kind of prayed by themselves or singly, but they would all pray together at the same time. And so you really couldn't understand what was being said except what you said yourself. And a lot of singing. They had some songs that they sang that were kind of more of a prayer meeting type song rather than the hymns that you used in the morning. And so after that, we would generally go home. A lot of times on Sunday afternoons after that, people would gather at the homes. And my mother played the piano. She had a piano. And so most of the time was spent in singing songs. And I remember that as one of the good experiences we had. Later on, when I was a little bit older, we also had what we called Christian Endeavor, and that was more or less an evening time. I guess it was supposed to be mostly for young people, but it was the same group of people that were in church the rest of the time as well. And we would maybe have a little more fun during those services, and it was not as organized or as systematic as the other services.
What denomination were you raised?
It was German Congregational. That later joined with the Congregational Christian churches and E&R churches, and Evangelical Reformed churches, and became the United Church of Christ. And some of the German Congregational churches remained with the United Church of Christ, and others kind of became more or less independent. And there's another couple of other congregational denominations now that. So the church I went to as a youngster now is what they call the 4 C's, or the Conservative Christian Congregational Church, which is a little more conservative than I've become.
Right. What were some of the other activities you took part in the church?
That was pretty much it. Oh, we also had our Christmas programs. And there again, it was pretty much the same as it was in school. You would learn a poem or a saying or a little essay or something, and then we would practice for about 4 weeks before Christmas on a Sunday afternoon, and then on Christmas Eve we would have the Christmas program. And we always had a Christmas tree with lights on it in the church. Of course, we had electricity in the church, so we could have electric lights. And then the youngsters would take their turns and recite their recitation. And then after it was over, we all got a little bag of nuts and candy and orange or apple or something like that. And then generally, at least for our family, we would go home and we would have our opening of the Christmas presents after the Christmas program. And of course, when I was real young, we would have Santa Claus come and pass out the gifts. Didn't last very long, I guess. I know I wasn't very old before there was no more Santa Claus, and I really never believed in Santa Claus that much, I guess. And I always knew that my parents were actually responsible for the gifts that I got at Christmas. And so when I didn't get very much, it really didn't matter, because I knew they gave me whatever they could, and there just wasn't much to be able to give.
Do you remember any of the gifts you received?
Yeah, I remember getting a tricycle. That was one of the great things that I got. Got a BB gun one year. I guess those are pretty much the things that I remember. I'm sure I got some other gift like clothes or something like that, but generally it was one item, and that was pretty much it for the Christmas. And we're happy to get that. When I look at some of the youngsters today and the rooms full of toys that they have, and they don't play with any of them, it brings back memories of how much you appreciated when you had one toy.
Were you confirmed?
I was confirmed, and I was confirmed in the German language. But our church was without a minister at the time, and so I went down to Glenullen, and I stayed down in Glenullen, and went to confirmation school there for 3 weeks. Got there a week late because our school let out a week later than Glenullen's. So I started kind of behind time, but I finished up learning the whole catechism in the German language and learning some of the Psalms, and also reading the Bible story book, which was also in German. So I completed the course, even though it was in 3 weeks instead of 4. And I don't know whether I should tell you this or not, but my second cousin also went from the church here and was confirmed there. She was just about my age, just a little bit older than I was, I guess. And she and another girl roomed together in the same room that I roomed. So there were 2 girls and myself in one room. And we had a wire across the middle of the room with some sheets that we would pull at night and divide the 2 rooms. The rest of the time, and there wasn't any hanky-panky or anything else, because I don't know, you studied and you tried to learn, and there was too much other things to do than to fool around.
Right.
And I guess I was just brought up that way, that there were things you did and things you didn't do.
Can you describe the confirmation ceremony?
Yes, the confirmation ceremony consisted of a worship service in which during which the confirmands were asked various questions from the catechism, and they would respond from their memory the response to the question that the minister would ask. And so that was pretty much the ceremony. And then of course then we knelt in front of the minister, and he would put his hand on our head and say that we were confirmed, that now we were responsible for our own faith. And then we received communion, our first communion at that time. So that was very meaningful to me. I still remember one of the hymns that we sang that was kind of our confirmation hymn was "Take My Life and Let It Be, Consecrated Lord to Thee." We also received a memory verse during our confirmation. And I guess I don't remember what that was. Some people remember it for a lifetime. But I guess the whole Bible was just, or at least the New Testament was important to me, so that it wasn't just one verse.
Did your family celebrate your confirmation?
No, because we were of course it was only Dad and I at that time. My mother had passed away just a few months before that. So there was no celebration of confirmation. I don't think most families celebrated, I'm not sure, but I know we didn't. It was, the religious service was the celebration, and that was enough.
Right. Were you able to question religious teachings when you were growing up?
Oh yes. Yeah, I guess I always asked questions. I was always inquisitive. And my dad would generally try to explain Mom to the best of their ability. And we had some Bible stories and things that I read, and once in a while I would ask them, how this was or how that was, and they would try to explain it to me. And they never said, well, this is the way it has to be. They always kind of let me make up my own faith. And I guess I've carried that with me for all my life. I feel the same way about other people, that everybody has to work out their own faith and live by that rather than what I think. And of course, having been a minister, I've run into a lot of people that did things that I really didn't agree with, like living with each other before they're married, but I never criticized them. If that's the way they felt, that was okay. And if they wanted to get married, that was fine too. I was very happy to do that for them.
All right. Is there anything else you'd like to share about religion or church when you were growing up?
I guess just kind of, well, there's one other thing too. After my mother died, I and my second cousin that got confirmed with me became the pianists for our church. And I could only play every other Sunday because I was working in the drugstore at that time, after school and on Saturdays and Sundays. Every other Sunday, I had every other Sunday off. And so I played for church during that time. Also became interested in singing, and when I went to college, was interested in singing in choirs and quartets and things. The other thing about church was that we had such a big argument about whether the service was going to change to English or whether it would stay German. And a lot of people got very angry, and I felt that they exhibited a lot of unchristian attitudes and actions during that time. And my dad always, I guess, kept his cool and always kind of tried to work for peace and harmony. And I often say I'm not sure why I ever got into the ministry growing up in a church with that kind of commotion during my early teens, and but I did. And I'll get into that a little bit later, I guess.
All right. Is there anything else about church that you'd like to share?
We had some revival meetings at the time, and it was at one of those revival meetings that the brother of our minister preached, and he told his life story. And he said that he had developed a real bad stomach problem, and he couldn't eat anymore. Every time he ate, he would either throw up or get deathly sick. And so one time he left the table to get some water from the well, and at that time he prayed. He said, God, if either take me or make me well, but if you make me well, I'll go into the ministry. And he went back in the house, sat down and ate the meal. And his mother got up from the table, went outside and cried because she thought he was going to die. And he was able to eat the meal and be okay. And at that time, I had decided that I was going to go in the ministry. I guess I felt that way from age 3 on up. But when my mother died, I tried to make up, I missed 2 weeks of school. And then I went back to school, and I tried to make up all the work in 1 week, and I nearly had a nervous breakdown. And so I missed another couple of weeks of school. And I never was the same in my studies, especially like typing. I was typing in January, I was typing like 70 some words a minute. When I finished the year, I was typing about 50. The nerves were just kind of shot. And so I decided that I wasn't going to be able to go to college. I just wasn't able to hack it. And then through that sermon of that minister, I said, okay, God, if you want me to go in the ministry, it's up to you. And I went and went through the studies, had a few more times when I thought I was going to quit, go back home. I got sick one time and asked my dad to wire me some money for the train fare home. And instead of wiring the money, he sent it by mail, which took 3-4 days. And by the time the money came, I'd gone to another doctor and I was able to get better. But at that time, I'd missed so many classes early in the morning in college that I just felt I couldn't continue like that. And then I got better, and by the time the money came, I decided maybe I ought to stay. So I did. And church has always been a real, I guess, important part of my life. And I don't think, I'm not a person that feels that the church makes you a good person or the church saves you or something like that. I always feel that the church can help and is a place where you can find other people that will support you and help you and where you can learn and things like that. But I don't think going to church necessarily is going to make a difference unless you really feel you're participating in part of it. My wife and I went to the same church as we were growing up. I really never paid much attention to her because I always felt she was kind of a scrawny little girl until she grew up, and all of a sudden I came home from college and I thought she was a pretty good looking gal. But her family was also very active in the church, and so we were kind of amenable to each other, kind of shared the same kind of faith, and also I think share the same kind of feeling that each one needs to have a faith of their own, and we don't tell each other what we have to believe or so on, but we share pretty much the same faith. So it's that was kind of a plus.
When did you start dating her?
I started dating her when I came home from my freshman year in college. So I was 17 at that time. And I had dated girls from the age of, I think when I was about 11 or 12, I started dating girls and always had a girlfriend. But then I had kind of a girlfriend in college that I thought maybe I'd like. And then she quit writing to me during the summer. And my dad said one day, he says, "What do you think about Norma?" I said, "Well, I don't know." He says, "Well, I think she's a pretty nice girl." So he took us both, as well as Norma's parents, to a rodeo in Mandan one time. That was our first date, more or less. And after that, we kind of got together, and after a year, we got engaged, and a year after that, we got married. The interesting thing there, I think, is too that going to college during the war years, we had about, I think, 17 male students in college, and we must have had about 100 or 150 female students. And so while I was going to college in my second year, even though I was going with Norma steady, I would also date other girls in college with the understanding that there was absolutely no relationship there except that I would provide transportation to go to movies or to football games or basketball games or things of that nature. And generally there was also another fellow with us. My roommate often went with me. So it was kind of unusual, but it worked out real well, and had friends in college that way. Not too many boys there, but
Great.
so she was 17 and I was 19 when we got married. Started pretty early. Had our 60th anniversary last August. It'll be 61 this August.
Wow. Can you tell us about your wedding?
Oh, the wedding was something else. That was the hottest day of the year in 1947, August 31st. And we had the wedding at the church. It was pretty much a regular wedding. A minister preached a sermon, and the minister had a son that was our age, and he had wanted Norma to marry him. And so the sermon was all about my duties to her instead of her duties. It was kind of interesting. And as she walked down the aisle, I sang "I Love You Truly," which was, I guess, unusual too. But then after the wedding, we went to her home out here on the farm, which is a mile and a half away, and we had the reception there. And her mother prepared all the food and everything for I don't know how many guests, but there were a lot of people there. And then shortly after that, a few days later, we were off to college, and our honeymoon was at the college. We were married for 2 years before I finished my Bachelor of Theology degree. And she worked at Gurney Seed Nursery, and I worked at Gurney. Well, the first year we were married, I worked at a grocery store most of the time. And the second year, no, that's not right. The first year in the fall, I worked at the grocery store, and then towards spring, I worked for Gurney Seed Nursery in their nursery department. And she worked in their seed department. And then the second year we were down there, she again worked for him, and I worked for the head of the nursery department in the office. He had told me when I came back that he wanted to give me a job, and I came back in the fall, and he says, I don't know what I would give you to do. And finally, a couple of weeks later, he asked me then again, and he said, if you're willing, I want you to work in the office, put in light bulbs, fix typewriters, do whatever you can, and read all the material you can about nursery stock. And then in the spring, when I get all my letters asking about nursery stock, I want you to answer all the letters you can and then put the rest on my desk. So that's what I did, and had a good time there. And then in the spring, the letters started coming in. A few one day, more the next, 200-300 a day, 400-500 a day. And I was working like 60 hours a week, besides carrying 18 hours at the college and seminary, and serving at church on Sundays.
We were talking about your years at college after you were married.
Okay. I think I kind of left off where I was working for the head of the nursery department. And so I worked my full head off that spring. And then about 4 weeks before graduation, he called me into the office and he asked me whether I would consider a job as head of the seed department of Gurney's nursery, and was offering me $150 a week, which in 49 was a lot of money. I told him that I had already committed myself to a church in Oklahoma. And he said, well, he said, you could work for me a couple of years and then you'd have enough money to buy your furniture and everything else and you could really start out on the right foot. But I turned it down and went to Oklahoma. But it was a real temptation, but I'm glad I turned it down because I'd probably still be there. Outside of that, college was not we had a good time at college and enjoyed it. We had made some friends in college that we have kept for a long time. We lived in a motel for 1 year, and then the next year we got what they called a GI trailer. And even though I wasn't a veteran or in the service, they had these trailer houses, small trailer houses, and we lived in one of those. And we were poor as mice, but we made it. And then we went out and served the church in Oklahoma, and I served that church for $150 a month instead of the job in Yankton for $150 a week. But and then later that year I was ordained in Oklahoma with the German Congregational Church. Okay. That's as far as college is concerned. And then we were in Oklahoma for 3.5 years. Then we moved to South Dakota and stayed there for 7 years. And then one of the counselor ministers thought that maybe I ought to go back and get my Master's of Divinity and maybe go from the German Congregational Church to the English Congregational or the Congregational Christian Church. In South Dakota, I had served a church that was a union of German and English congregational churches. And I really felt more at home with the English people than I did with the German ones. So in the fall of 1960, or the summer of 1960, I and another minister from the southern part of the state went out to check out the Andover Newton Theological Seminary in Andover Newton, or Newton Center, and enrolled there. So in the fall of 1960, we moved out there, and I went to seminary out there and got my Bachelor of Divinity in 3 years. And at that time, I became an associate minister of one of the fairly large churches in the Boston, well, one of the suburbs of Boston, and commuted back and forth to the seminary. Stayed at that church then for 12 years, and then served other churches in the area. Also became a probation officer and did that for 20 years, plus being in a church as a part-time associate, plus being a hospital chaplain. So I was doing 1 full-time and 2 part-time jobs. If you can think of a minister as being a part-time job, I used to put in a lot of hours. And luckily, I had the stamina and energy to do it. But so then 6 years ago, we came back here. The last church I served there, I was there for 18 years. And we bought this place 2 years before we moved back. We had a place in Beulah that we would spend. Norma would generally come out in the summer months and spend the summer months here because her dad and family was here. And I would come out for 3 or 4 weeks in the fall and help my cousin with harvest because he farmed my land, rented my land, and I'd help him with the harvest because he was alone. He and his wife were alone. But then we bought this place, and in 2002 we moved in here and became permanent residents here a couple of years after we bought it. And we've enjoyed it. Except that I'm not sure I'm retired. I just preached 4 times in the last 3 weeks, so and I like to fill in, help churches out. And I never realized, I guess, what impression it would make on anybody, except that one of the ministers about several weeks ago said what an inspiration I was to him to still be serving churches and preaching at my age. So I guess you never know how you affect people in their ministry. I feel that my ministry as a probation officer was one of the most meaningful ministries I've had. Dealt with a lot of alcoholics, drug addicts, family problems, and that was just a ministry in itself. Even though I never really used the biblical languages or religious languages, it rubbed off on people. One of the fortunate things that I have here is that my standing as a minister of the United Church of Christ is acceptable by the Methodists and by the Lutherans, by the Congregational, and so I can do the sacraments in those churches as well as preach there. And it's been helpful in a couple of kind of emergencies where the minister got sick and said, I've got a baptism. Would you be able to do it for me?
Okay.
So I don't know where we go from here.
Well, I think we're going to just have to go back in time a little bit and talk about holidays when you were growing up. Which was your favorite?
I guess Christmas was a favorite because that was pretty much the only holiday that we really celebrated. And when I was young, of course, there was a Christmas program on Christmas Eve, and then there was church service on Christmas Day. And for a few years, there was a church service on the second day of Christmas. So that became a real celebration of family and church. And that was very meaningful. And Easter was just pretty much another Sunday. We didn't do anything special except to celebrate Easter as a church service. The other holidays like Thanksgiving and so on were not that special because, first of all, we didn't have the food to put on a big bash of a meal. And so it was just kind of a regular, more or less a religious celebration. We'd have church service in the morning, and then we'd go home and have our dinner. The other holidays...
4th of July?
4th of July, we always had firecrackers, and we would light those up. Generally, there wasn't much of a celebration either. But I remember one time we went to Beulah, and we were on or it started to rain, and we were on our way home, and it rained 7 inches in a short time, and we never made it home that night. We got stuck in down in a valley where the water was crossing the road, and the car went out, and so we walked out. My parents grabbed me by the 2 arms because my feet would not touch the ground. They just went with the flow of the water, and we stayed at one of the families near the highway overnight. And the next morning we started for home, and bridges were out all over the place, and we had to be pulled across one of the creeks by horses, and got home, and everything was kind of, it really had flooded out a lot. The home wasn't flooded out, thank God, but a lot of other things were flooded out. But another time when I felt that maybe I wouldn't have been here if it hadn't been for my parents. New Year's, can't remember. We always had church on New Year's morning, but New Year's Eve, I don't really remember having a celebration, except after 12 o'clock, somebody would shoot off a shotgun a couple of times outside the house, and then they would recite reading, and then we'd invite them in for some wine or a drink and some goodies, and that was our New Year's celebration, except for the service on New Year's Day then. Birthdays, Mom would make an angel food cake, and we would have a cake which was pretty unusual, a cake for her birthday, and pretty much that was it. And generally that was my birthday. I don't think they really celebrated their birthdays that much. My birthday also happened to be the same day as one of my teachers in high school, and she was really my favorite teacher. She was just very good. And so a couple of years we invited her out to our place for her birthday and my birthday.
Right. Is there anything else you remember about celebrations or holidays when you were growing up?
Not that I can really think of. Probably remember them tomorrow, but
Okay. Well, in that case, you've kind of hinted at this a couple of times, but what do you remember about the Dirty 30s?
those were tough times. Of course, the crops were extremely poor. We always had some crop, but the wheat would maybe be 1.5 bushels or 2 bushels an acre, and it was so light you could just about blow it out of your hand with a breath. So there wasn't really that much there. The dust storms to some extent, although we didn't have quite as much dust storm right here as they had in many of the other places. The ground here is a little better and a little harder than it is on the sand hills south of town. But the other thing that happened was that we had the grasshopper invasion, and those grasshoppers would just eat everything and anything that was in their path. And I remember that we put some poison out for them one year, and poisoned a lot of them. But I guess that also poisoned a lot of the birds and destroyed a lot of the birds, so it was kind of a bad thing to do, but they didn't know any better at that time, so didn't think it was going to affect the birds. There just wasn't any money. My dad finally went to work with the WPA project. I don't know what exactly the words were on that, but he went to work with a team of horses and a scraper, building a road, the road that went by our house there. And so I think he got $40 a month for his work and the horses. And that kind of helped us through at least 1 year, so that we could afford the gas and the put in a crop. There were hard times, but you made the best of it.
All right. What was your most stressful childhood experience?
By childhood, how old does that include?
Up until you were married.
I guess the most stressful was when my mother died. Even though I felt that I reacted very well to that, it was still a pretty emotional experience. The only other experience I think that was worse than that was when our daughter died at the age of 44. But my mother was 37 years old, and she was still a very young person compared to what we think of as people. And she was a good person. She loved me with everything she had, I think. And of course, it wasn't just missing her. It was also seeing the devastation of my father. She was the love of his life. He was pretty devastated with that too. And it was kind of lucky that we had each other and could help each other out. But I think that was the most stressful.
Okay. What was your happiest childhood memory?
I'm not sure that I have a happiest childhood memory. I think there were so many of them that were good. I mean, if you have loving parents and they care for you and you're able to share with them and those are happy times. And especially my father, I could confide in him with anything and everything. My father had a way of teaching me that I wish I could have emulated a little better than I did. But when I was a little older and I'd run into a problem to which I didn't have an answer, and I'd go to him and I'd say, Dad, I can't figure this out. What do I do? This is my situation. I really feel trapped. And he'd say, well, you got to think it through. And I said, well, I have. I've tried. I just can't find an answer. And after pushing him a few times, he would respond by saying, well, I guess if I would have to do it, I would probably do this. Never told me what to do or what I should do, but if I had to do it, I would probably do this. And I thought that was such a great way of teaching a person to make their own decision with some guidance, but without pressuring them that this is the way you need to do it. So those were just good times, you know.
All right. What was the most adventurous thing you did as a child?
I'm not sure that I know of any real adventurous things I did either. One time I tried to leave home. I got upset for something or another. I can't even remember what it was. But I decided that I was going to go somewhere else. And so I took off without telling my parents, but I took off. And I suppose I must have walked about 1/8 of a mile when I decided to come back. I guess that's about as adventurous as it got.
How old were you?
I don't know, probably about 7 or 8, something like that. I was pretty young.
All right. Is there anything else about your childhood that you'd like to share with us?
Oh, I think I've shared just about everything I can remember. uh, as I say, I just felt that I had wonderful parents, and even though it wasn't the easiest of times, we were all in it together, and we kept on making it, one way or another.
Why do you think it's important to share your life story?
In this age and in this day and age, I suppose if anyone else can learn anything from my experiences, it's worthwhile. I I think in my lifetime, and especially in my ministry, what I have felt has been the greatest reward and the greatest blessing is when I've been able to help other people maybe make a little better life of their situation. And I always felt that that was kind of the Spirit of God working through me. And a lot of times I did things and I don't know why, but I did. And people said, "Oh, you helped me so much." I remember one young person, I guess he must have been in his 30s at the time, meeting us in a store. And he said, "You're Reverend Zuern, aren't you?" And I said, "Yes." He says, "Oh, so many times I wanted to thank you what you did for my family, for me and my family." And I said, "What?" I didn't say it, but I thought it. I said, "What did I do?" And then I thought about it. He had an alcoholic father, and I would visit once in a while, and I would try to, help them along. And of course, they were in the church youth group, and I was always try to be there for him, and always tried to help and understand. And I guess it was so meaningful for him. I paid no attention to it, really. So I think if any of us can be of help to anyone else to maybe learn to live a little better or do a little better job of making decisions or turning their lives around in some way or another to a better way, that's what we're here for.
Okay.
As I preached Sunday morning, that I preached about the compassion of Jesus, and I said, we're that compassion today. We're the love and the hands and the feet. And we're the ones that help those that are not doing so well or that need a little help or whatever. So I guess that's the reason I'm doing this.
All right. Are there any other thoughts or observations you'd like to share with us?
Well, I suppose I could preach a few sermons, but I guess I've always felt that what I said has never been quite as important as to what I did, and that my relationship with people has been much more important than the preaching I've done. I've had very few people that said, "Oh, that sermon you preached made such a difference in my life." But I've had a lot of people say what I did made a difference. And that doesn't mean that people haven't commented and praised me on sermons. I get a lot of that. But it's not that I feel that it's turned their lives around. Maybe it has, but hope it has, but it doesn't matter.
All right.
Okay.
Well, thank you so much for sharing your stories with us.
Well, you're welcome. Glad you made it here.